Section 16 of Lives of Girls Who Became Famous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulais. Lives of Girls Who Became Famous by Sarah K. Bolton. Section 16. Florence Nightingale. One of the most interesting places in the whole of London is St. Thomas's Hospital, an immense four-story structure of brick with stone trimmings. Here is the Nightingale Training School for Nurses, established through the gift to Miss Nightingale of $250,000 by the government for her wonderful work in the Crimean War. She would not take a cent for herself, but was glad to have this institution opened, that girls through her training might become valuable to the world as nurses, as she has been. Here is the Nightingale House. The dining room, with its 3 long tables, is an inviting apartment. The colors of wall and ceiling are in red and light shades. Here is a Swiss clock presented by the Grand Duchess of Baden. Here is a harpsichord, also a gift. Here is the marble face and figure I have come especially to see, that of lovely Florence Nightingale. It is a face full of sweetness and refinement, having withal an earnest look, as though life were well worth living. What better work than to direct these girls how to be useful? Some are here from the highest social circles. The probationers, or nurse pupils, must remain 3 years before they can become Protestant sisters. Each ward is in charge of a sister. Now it is Leopold, because the ward bears that name, and now Victoria, in respect to the Queen, who opened the institution. The sisters look sunny and healthy, though they work hard. They have regular hours for being off duty, and exercise in the open air. The patients tell me how homelike it seems to have women in the wards, and what a comfort it is in their agony to be handled by their careful hands. Here are 400 persons in all phases of suffering, in neat, cheerful wards, brightened by pots of flowers, and the faces of kind, devoted women. And who is this woman to whom the government of Great Britain felt that it owed so much, and whom the whole world delights to honor? Florence Nightingale, born in 1820, in the beautiful Italian city of that name, is the younger of 2 daughters of William Shore Nightingale, a wealthy landowner, who inherited both the name and fortune of his grand-uncle, Peter Nightingale. The mother was the daughter of the eminent philanthropist and member of Parliament, William Smith. Most of Miss Nightingale's life has been spent on their beautiful estate, Lea Hurst, in Derbyshire, a lovely home in the midst of picturesque scenery. In her youth her father instructed her carefully in the classics and higher mathematics. A few years later, partly through extensive travel, she became proficient in French, German, and Italian. Rich, pretty, and well educated, what was there more that she could wish for? Her heart, however, did not turn towards a fashionable life. Very early she began to visit the poor and the sick near Lea Hurst, and her father's other estate at Embry Park, Hampshire. Perhaps the mantle of the mother's father had fallen upon the young girl. She had also the greatest tenderness toward dumb animals, and could never bear to see them injured. Miss Aldridge, in an interesting sketch of Miss Nightingale, quotes the following story from Little Folks. Some years ago, when the celebrated Florence Nightingale was a little girl, living at her father's home, a large old Elizabethan house, with great woods about it, in Hampshire, there was one thing that struck everybody who knew her. It was that she seemed to be always thinking what she could do to please or help anyone who needed either help or comfort. She was very fond, too, of animals, and she was so gentle in her way that even the shyest of them would come quite close to her, and pick up whatever she flung down for them to eat. There was, in the garden behind the house, a long walk with trees on each side, the abode of many squirrels, and when Florence came down the walk, dropping nuts as she went along, the squirrels would run down the trunks of their trees, and hardly waiting until she passed by, would pick up the prize and dart away, with their little bushy tails curled over their backs, and their black eyes looking about as if terrified at the least noise, though they did not seem to be afraid of Florence. Then there was an old gray pony named Peggy, past work, living in a paddock, with nothing to do all day long but to amuse herself. Whenever Florence appeared at the gate, Peggy would come trotting up and put her nose into the dress pocket of her little mistress, and pick it of the apple or the roll of bread that she knew she would always find there, for this was a trick Florence had taught the pony. Florence was fond of riding, and her father's old friend, the clergyman of the parish, used often to come and take her for a ride with him when he went to the farm cottages at a distance. He was a good man, and very kind to the poor. As he had studied medicine when a young man, he was able to tell people what would do them good when they were ill, or had met with an accident. Little Florence took great delight in helping to nurse those who were ill, and whenever she went on these long rides, she had a small basket fastened to her saddle, filled with something nice, which she saved from her breakfast or dinner, or carried for her mother, who was very good to the poor. There lived in one of 2 or 3 solitary cottages in the wood an old shepherd of her father's, named Roger, who had a favourite sheepdog named Cap. Roger had neither wife nor child, and Cap lived with him and kept him company at night after he had penned his flock. Cap was a very sensible dog. Indeed, people used to say he could do everything but speak. He kept the sheep in wonderfully good order, and thus saved his master a great deal of trouble. One day, as Florence and her old friend were out for a ride, they came to a field where they found the shepherd giving his sheep their night feed, but he was without the dog, and the sheep knew it, for they were scampering in every direction. Florence and her friend noticed that the old shepherd looked very sad, and they stopped to ask what was the matter, and what had become of his dog. "Oh," said Roger, "Cap will never be of any more use to me. I'll have to hang him, poor fellow, as soon as I go home tonight." "Hang him?" said Florence. "Oh, Roger, how wicked of you! What has dear old Cap done?" "He has done nothing," replied Roger, "but he will never be of any more use to me, and I cannot afford to keep him for nothing. One of the mischievous schoolboys throwed a stone at him yesterday and broke one of his legs." And the old shepherd's eyes filled with tears, which he wiped away with his shirt sleeve. Then he drove his spade deep into the ground to hide what he felt, for he did not like to be seen crying. "Poor Cap," he sighed. "He was as knowing almost as a human being." "But are you sure his leg is broken?" asked Florence. "Oh yes, miss. It is broken safe enough. He has not put his foot to the ground since." Florence and her friend rode on without saying anything more to Roger. "We will go and see poor Cap," said the vicar. "I don't believe the leg is really broken. It would take a big stone and a hard blow to break the leg of a big dog like Cap." "Oh, if you could but cure him, how glad Roger would be!" replied Florence. They soon reached the shepherd's cottage, but the door was fastened, and when they moved the latch, such a furious barking was heard that they drew back, startled. However, a little boy came out of the next cottage, and asked if they wanted to go in, as Roger had left the key with his mother. So the key was got, and the door opened. And there on the brick floor lay the dog, his hair dishevelled, and his eyes sparkling with anger at the intruders. But when he saw the little boy he grew peaceful, and when he looked at Florence, and he heard her call him "poor Cap," he began to wag his short tail, and then crept from under the table and lay down at her feet. She took hold of one of his paws and patted his old rough head, and talked to him, whilst her friend examined the injured leg. It was painfully swollen, and hurt very much to have it examined, but the dog knew it was meant kindly, and though he moaned and winced with pain, he licked the hands that were hurting him. "It's only a bad bruise. No bones were broken," said her old friend. "Rest is all Cap needs. He will soon be well again." "I am so glad," said Florence. "But can we do nothing for him? He seems in such pain." "There is one thing that would ease the pain and heal the leg all the sooner, and that is plenty of hot water to foment the part." Florence struck a light with the tinder box and lighted the fire, which was already laid. She then set off to the other cottage to get something to bathe the leg with. She found an old petticoat hanging up to dry, and this she carried off, tore up into strips, which she wrung out in warm water, and laid them tenderly on Cap's swollen leg. It was not long before the poor dog felt the benefit of the application, and he looked grateful, wagging his little stump of a tail in thanks. On their way home they met the shepherd coming slowly along, with a piece of rope in his hand. "Oh, Roger," cried Florence, "you are not to hang poor old Cap. His leg is not broken at all." "No, he will serve you yet," said the vicar. "Well, I be main glad to hear it," said the shepherd, "and many thanks to you for going to see him." On the next morning Florence was up early, and the first thing she did was to take 2 flannel petticoats to give to the poor woman whose skirt she had torn up to bathe Cap. Then she went to the dog, and was delighted to find the swelling of his leg much less. She bathed it again, and Cap was as grateful as before. 2 or 3 days afterwards Florence and her friend were riding together, when they came up to Roger and his sheep. This time Cap was watching the sheep, though he was lying quite still, and pretending to be asleep. When he heard the voice of Florence speaking to his master, who was portioning out the usual food, his tail wagged and his eyes sparkled, but he did not get up, for he was on duty. The shepherd stopped his work, and as he glanced at the dog with a merry laugh, said, "Do look at the dog, miss. He be so pleased to hear your voice." Cap's tail went faster and faster. "I be glad," continued the old man, "I did not hang him. I be greatly obliged to you, miss, and the vicar, for what you did. But for you I would have hanged the best dog I ever had in my life." A girl who was made so happy in saving the life of an animal would naturally be interested to save human beings. Occasionally her family passed a season in London, and here, instead of giving much time to concerts or parties, she would visit hospitals and benevolent institutions. When the family travelled in Egypt, she attended several sick Arabs, who recovered under her hands. They doubtless thought the English girl was a saint sent down from heaven. The more she felt drawn toward the sick, the more she felt the need of study, and the more she saw the work that refined women could do in the hospitals. The Sisters of Charity were standing by sick beds. Why could there not be Protestant sisters? When they travelled in Germany, France, and Italy, she visited infirmaries, asylums, and hospitals, carefully noting the treatment given in each. Finally she determined to spend some months at Kaiserwerth, near Dusseldorf on the Rhine, in Pastor Fliedner's great Lutheran hospital. He had been a poor clergyman, the leader of a scanty flock, whose church was badly in debt. A man of much enterprise and warm heart, he could not see his work fail for lack of means, so he set out among the provinces to tell the needs of his little parish. He collected funds, and learned much about the poverty and ignorance of cities, preached in some of the prisons, because interested in criminals, and went back to his loyal people. But so poor were they that they could not meet the yearly expenses, so he determined to raise an endowment fund. He visited Holland and Great Britain, and secured the needed money. In England, in 1832, he became acquainted with Elizabeth Fry. How one good life influences another to the end of time! When he went back to Germany, his heart was aglow with a desire to help humanity. He at once opened an asylum for discharged prison women. He saw how almost impossible it was for those who had been in prison to obtain situations. Then he opened a school for the children of such as worked in factories, for he realized how unfit for citizenship are those who grow up in ignorance. He did not have much money, but he seemed able to obtain what he really needed. Then he opened a hospital, a home for insane women, a home of rest for his nurses, or for those who needed a place to live after their work was done. Soon the deaconesses at Kaiserwerth became known the country over. Among the wildest Norwegian mountains, we met some of these Kaiserwerth nurses, refined, educated ladies, getting in summer a new lease of life for their noble labors. This Protestant sisterhood consists now of about 700 sisters, at about 200 stations, the annual expense being about $150,000. What a grand work for one man, with no money, the pastor of a very humble church! Into this work of Pastor Fliedner, Florence Nightingale heartily entered. Was it strange taste for a pretty and wealthy young woman, whose life had been one of sunshine and happiness. It was a saint-like taste, and the world is rendered a little like paradise by the presence of such women. Back in London, the papers were full of the great exhibition of 1851, but she was more interested in her Kaiserwerth work than to be at home. When she had finished her course of instruction, Pastor Fliedner said, since he had been director of that institution, no one had ever passed so distinguished an examination, or shown herself so thoroughly mistress of all she had learned. On her return to Lea Hurst, she could not rest very long, while there was so much work to be done in the world. In London, a hospital for sick governesses was about to fail, from lack of means and poor management. Nobody seemed very deeply interested for these overworked teachers. But Miss Nightingale was interested, and leaving her lovely home, she came to the dreary house in Harley Street, where she gave her time and her fortune for several years. Her own frail health sank for a time from the close confinement, but she had seen the institution placed on a sure foundation, and prosperous. The Crimean War had begun. England had sent out shiploads of men to the Black Sea to engage in war with Russia. Little thought seemed to have been taken, in the hurry and enthusiasm of war, to provide proper clothing or food for the men in that changing climate. In the desolate country there was almost no means of transportation, and men and animals suffered from hunger. After the first winter, cholera broke out, and in one camp 20 men died in 24 hours. Matters grew from bad to worse. William Howard Russell, the Times correspondent, wrote home to England. It is now pouring rain. The skies are black as ink. The wind is howling over the staggering tents. The trenches are turned into dikes. In the tents the water is sometimes a foot deep. Our men have not either warm or waterproof clothing. They are out for 12 hours at a time in the trenches. They are plunged into the inevitable miseries of a winter campaign, and not a soul seems to care for their comfort, or even for their lives. These are hard truths, but the people of England must hear them. They must know that the wretched beggar who wanders about the streets of London in the rain leads the life of a prince, compared with the British soldiers who are fighting out here for their country. The commonest accessories of a hospital are wanting. There is not the least attention paid to the decency or cleanliness. The stench is appalling. The fetid air can barely struggle out to taint the atmosphere, save through chinks in the walls and roofs. And, for all I can observe, these men die without the least effort being made to save them. There they lie, just as they were let gently down on the ground by the poor fellows, their comrades, who brought them on their backs from the camp with the greatest tenderness, but who are not allowed to remain with them. The sick appear to be tended by the sick, and the dying by the dying. During the rigorous winter of 1854, with snow 3 feet thick, many were frozen in their tents. Out of nearly 45,000, over 18,000 were reported in the hospitals. The English nation became aroused at this state of things, and in less than 2 weeks, $75,000 poured into the Times office for the suffering soldiers. A special commissioner, Mr. MacDonald, was sent to the Crimea with shirts, sheets, flannels, and necessary food. But one of the greatest of all needs was woman's hand and brain, in the dreadful suffering and the confusion. The testimony of the world thus far has been that men everywhere need the help of women, and women everywhere need the help of men. Right Honorable Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of War, knew of but one woman who could bring order and comfort to those faraway hospitals, and that woman was Miss Nightingale. She had made herself ready at Kaiserwerth for a great work, and now a great work was ready for her. But she was in frail health. And was it probable that a rich and refined lady would go thousands of miles from her kindred to live in feverish wards where there were only men? A true woman dares do anything that helps the world. Mr. Herbert wrote her, October 15. There is, as far as I know, only one person in England capable of organizing and directing such a plan, and I have been several times on the point of asking you if you would be disposed to make the attempt. That it will be difficult to form a corps of nurses, no one knows better than yourself. I have this simple question to put to you. Could you go out yourself and take charge of everything? It is, of course, understood that you will have absolute authority over all the nurses, unlimited power to draw on the government for all you judge necessary to the success of your mission, and I think I may assure you of the cooperation of the medical staff. Your personal qualities, your knowledge, and your authority in administrative affairs all fit you for this position." It was a strange coincidence that on the same day, October 15, Miss Nightingale, her heart stirred for the suffering soldiers, had written a letter to Mr. Herbert, offering her services to the government. A few days later the world read, with moistened eyes, this letter from the War Office. "Miss Nightingale, accompanied by 34 nurses, will leave this evening. Miss Nightingale, who has, I believe, greater practical experience of hospital administration and treatment than any other lady in this country, has, with a self-devotion for which I have no words to express my gratitude, undertaken this noble but arduous work." The heart of the English nation followed the heroic woman. Mrs. Jameson wrote, "It is an undertaking wholly new to our English customs, much at variance with the usual education given to women in this country. If it succeeds, it will be the true, the lasting glory of Florence Nightingale and her band of devoted assistants, that they have broken down a Chinese wall of prejudices, religious, social, professional, and have established a precedent which will, indeed, multiply the good to all time." She did succeed, and the results can scarcely be overestimated. As the band of nurses passed through France, hotel keepers would take no pay for their accommodation. Poor fisherwomen at Boulogne struggled for the honor of carrying their baggage to the railway station. They sailed in the Vectis across the Mediterranean, reaching Scutari, November 5th, the day of the Battle of Inkerman. They found in the great barrack hospital, which had been lent to the British by the Turkish government, and in another large hospital near by, about 4,000 men. The corridors were filled with 2 rows of mattresses, so close that persons could scarcely walk between them. There was work to be done at once. One of the nurses wrote home, "The whole of yesterday one could only forget one's own existence, for it was spent, first in sewing the men's mattresses together, and then in washing them, and assisting the surgeons, when we could, in dressing their ghastly wounds after their 5 days' confinement on board ship, during which space their wounds had not been dressed. Hundreds of men with fever, dysentery, and cholera, the wounded were the smaller portion, filled the wards in succession from the overcrowded transports." Miss Nightingale, calm and unobtrusive, went quietly among the men, always with a smile of sympathy for the suffering. The soldiers often wept, as for the first time in months, even years, a woman's hands adjusted their pillows, and a woman's voice soothed their sorrows. Miss Nightingale's pathway was not an easy one. Her coming did not meet the general approval of military or medical officials. Some thought women would be in the way. Others felt that their coming was an interference. Possibly some did not like to have persons about who would be apt to tell the truth on their return to England. But with good sense and much tact she was able to overcome the disaffection, using her almost unlimited power with discretion. As soon as the wounded were attended to, she established an invalid's kitchen, where appetizing food could be prepared, one of the essentials in convalescence. Here she overlooked the proper cooking for 800 men who could not eat ordinary food. Then she established a laundry. The beds and shirts of the men were in a filthy condition, some wearing the ragged clothing in which they were brought down from the Crimea. It was difficult to obtain either food or clothing, partly from the immense amount of red tape in official life. Miss Nightingale seemed to be everywhere. Dr. Pincoff said, "I believe that there never was a severe case of any kind that escaped her notice, and sometimes it was wonderful to see her at the bedside of a patient who had been admitted perhaps but an hour before, and of whose arrival one could hardly have supposed it possible she could already be cognizant." She aided the senior chaplain in establishing a library and schoolroom, and in getting up evening lectures for the men. She supplied books and games, wrote letters for the sick, and forwarded their little savings to their home friends. For a year and a half, till the close of the war, she did a wonderful work, reducing the death rate in the barrack hospital from 60% to a little above 1%, said the Times correspondent. Wherever there is disease in its most dangerous form, and the hand of the spoiler distressingly nigh, there is that incomparable woman sure to be seen. Her benignant presence is an influence for good comfort, even amid the struggles of expiring nature. She is a ministering angel, without any exaggeration, in these hospitals, and as her slender form glides quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at the sight of her. When all the medical officers have retired for the night, and silence and darkness have settled down upon these miles of prostrate sick, she may be observed, alone, with a little lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds. With the heart of a true woman and the manner of a lady, accomplished and refined beyond most of her sex, she combines a surprising calmness of judgment and promptitude and decision of character. The popular instinct was not mistaken, which, when she set out from England on her mission of mercy, hailed her as a heroine. I trust she may not earn her title to a higher, though sadder appellation. No one who has observed her frail figure and delicate health can avoid misgivings lest these should fail. One of the soldiers wrote home. She would speak to one and another, and nod and smile to many more. But she could not do it all, you know, for we lay there by hundreds. But we could kiss her shadow as it fell, and lay our heads on our pillows again content. Another wrote home. Before she came there was such cussing and swearing, and after that it was as holy as a church. No wonder she was called the Angel of the Crimea. Once she was prostrated with fever, but recovered after a few weeks. Finally the war came to an end. London was preparing to give Miss Nightingale a royal welcome, when lo, she took passage by design on a French steamer and reached Lea Hurst, August 15, 1856, unbeknown to anyone. There was a murmur of disappointment at first, but the people could only honor all the more the woman who wished no blare of trumpets for her humane acts. Queen Victoria sent for her to visit her at Balmoral, and presented her with a valuable jewel, a ruby red enamel cross with a white field, encircled by a black band with the words, "Blessed are the merciful." The letters V.R., surmounted by a crown in diamonds, are impressed upon the center of the cross. Green enamel branches of palm, tipped with gold, form the framework of the shield, while around their stems is a riband of blue enamel, with the single word, Crimea. On the top are 3 brilliant stars of diamonds. On the back is an inscription written by the Queen. The Sultan sent her a magnificent bracelet, and the government $250,000 to found the school for nurses at St. Thomas's Hospital. Since the war, Miss Nightingale has never been in strong health, but she has written several valuable books. Her hospital notes, published in 1859, have furnished plans for scores of new hospitals. Her Notes on Nursing, published in 1860, of which over 100,000 have been sold, deserve to be in every home. She is the most earnest advocate of sunlight and fresh air. She says, "An extraordinary fallacy is the dread of night air. What air can we breathe at night but night air? The choice is between pure night air from without and foul night air from within. Most people prefer the latter, an unaccountable choice. What will they say if it be proved true that fully 1/2 of all the disease we suffer from is occasioned by people sleeping with their windows shut? An open window most nights of the year can never hurt anyone. In great cities night air is often the best and purest to be had in the 24 hours. The 5 essentials for healthy houses," she says, are pure air, pure water, efficient drainage, cleanliness, and light. I have known whole houses and hospitals smell of the sink. I have met just as strong a stream of sewer air coming up the back staircase of a grand London house, from the sink, as I have ever met at Scutari. And I have seen the rooms in that house all ventilated by the open windows, and the passages all unventilated by the closed windows, in order that as much of the sewer air as possible might be conducted into and retained in the bedrooms. It is wonderful." Miss Nightingale has much humor, and she shows it in her writings. She is opposed to dark houses, says they promote scrofula, to old papered walls, and to carpets full of dust. An uninhabited room becomes full of foul air soon, and needs to have the windows open often. She would keep sick people, or well, forever in the sunlight if possible, for sunlight is the greatest possible purifier of the atmosphere. In the unsunned sides of narrow streets, there is degeneracy and weakliness of the human race, mind and body equally degenerating. Of the ruin wrought by bad air, she says, "Oh, the crowded National School, where so many children's epidemics have their origin, what a tale its air test would tell! We should have parents saying, and saying rightly, 'I will not send my child to that school. The air test stands at horrid.' And the dormitories of our great boarding schools. Scarlet fever would be no more ascribed to contagion, but to its right cause, the air test standing at foul. We should hear no longer of mysterious dispensations, and of plague and pestilence being in God's hands, when, so far as we know, he has put them into our own. She urges much rubbing of the body, washing with warm water and soap. The only way I know to remove dust is to wipe everything with a damp cloth. If you must have a carpet, the only safety is to take it up 2 or 3 times a year, instead of once. The best wall now extant is oil paint. Nursing is an art, and if it is to be made an art, requires as exclusive a devotion, as hard as a preparation, as any painter's or sculptor's work. For what is the having to do with dead canvas or cold marble, compared with having to do with the living body, the temple of God's Spirit? Nursing is one of the fine arts, I had almost said, the finest of the fine arts." Miss Nightingale has also written Observations on the Sanitary State of the Army in India, 1863, Life or Death in India, read before the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science, 1873, with an appendix on Life or Death by Irrigation, 1874. She is constantly doing deeds of kindness. With a subscription sent recently by her to the Gordon Memorial Fund, she said, "Might but the example of this great and pure hero be made to tell, in that self no longer exists to him, but only God and duty, on the soldiers who have died to save him, and on boys who should live to follow him." Miss Nightingale has helped to dignify labor and to elevate humanity, and thus has made her name immortal. Florence Nightingale died August 13, 1910, at 2 p.m., of heart failure, at the age of 90. She had received many distinguished honors, the freedom of the City of London in 1908, and from King Edward VII, a year previously, a membership in the Order of Merit, given only to a select few men, such as Field Marshal Roberts, Lord Kitchener, Alma Tadema, James Bruce, George Meredith, Lords Kelvin and Lister, and Admiral Togo. Her funeral was a quiet one, according to her wishes. End of section 16.
Section 17 of Lives of Girls Who Became Famous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jedopi. Lives of Girls Who Became Famous by Sarah K. Bolton. Section 17. Lady Brassey. One of my pleasantest days in England was spent at Old Battle Abbey, the scene of the ever memorable Battle of Hastings, where William of Normandy conquered the Saxon Harold. The abbey was built by William as a thank-offering for the victory, on the spot where Harold set up his standard. The old gateway is one of the finest in England. Part of the ancient church remains, flowers and ivy growing out of the beautiful Gothic arches. As one stands upon the walls and looks out upon the sea, that great battle comes up before him. The Norman hosts disembark. First come the archers in short tunics, with bows as tall as themselves, and quivers full of arrows. Then the knights in coats of mail, with long lances and two-edged swords. Duke William steps out last from the ship, and falls foremost on both hands. His men gather about him in alarm, but he says, See, my lords, I have taken possession of England with both my hands. It is now mine, and what is mine is yours." Word is sent to Harold to surrender the throne, but he returns answer as haughty as is sent. Brave and noble, he plants his standard, a warrior sparkling with gold and precious stones, and thus addresses his men: "The Normans are good knights and well used to war. If they pierce our ranks we are lost. Cleave and do not spare." Then they built up a breastwork of shields, which no man can pass alive. William of Normandy is ready for action. He in turn addresses his men: "Spare not and strike hard. There will be booty for all. It will be in vain to ask for peace. The English will not give it. Flight is impossible. At the sea you will find neither ship nor bridge. The English would overtake and annihilate you there. The victory is in our hands." From 9 till 3 the battle rages. The case becomes desperate. William orders the archers to fire into the air, as they cannot pierce English armor, and arrows fall down like rain upon the Saxons. Harold is pierced in the eye. He is soon overcome and trampled to death by the enemy, dying, it is said, with the words "Holy Cross" upon his lips. 10,000 are killed on either side, and the Saxons pass forever under foreign rule. Harold's mother comes and begs the body of her son, and pays for it, some historians say, its weight in gold. Every foot of ground at Battle Abbey is historic, and all the country round most interesting. We drive over the smoothest of roads to a palace in the distance, Normanhurst, the home of Lady Brassey, the distinguished author and traveller. Towers are at either corner and in the centre, and ivy climbs over the spacious vestibule to the roof. Great buildings for waterworks, conservatories, and the like are adjoining in the midst of flower gardens and acres of lawn and forest. It is a place fit for the abode of royalty itself. In no home have I seen so much that is beautiful gathered from all parts of the world. The hall, as you enter, square and hung with crimson velvet, is adorned with valuable paintings. 2 easy chairs before the fireplace are made from ostriches, their backs forming the seats. These birds were gifts to Lady Brassey in her travels. In the rooms beyond are treasures from Japan, the South Sea Islands, South America, indeed from everywhere. Cases of pottery, works in marble, Dresden candelabra, ancient armor, furs, silks, all arrayed with exquisite taste. One room, called the Marie Antoinette room, has the curtains and furniture in yellow of this unfortunate queen. Here are pictures by Sir Frederick Leighton, Landseer, and others. Stuffed birds and fishes and animals from every clime, with flowers in profusion. In the dining room, with its gray walls and red furniture, is a large painting of the mistress of this superb home, with her favorite horse and dogs. The views from the windows are beautiful. Battle Abbey ruin in the distance, and rivers flowing to the sea. The house is rich in color, one room being blue, another red, a third yellow, while large mirrors seem to repeat the apartments again and again. As we leave the home, not the least of its attractions come up the grounds, a load of merry children, all in sailor hats, the Mabel and Muriel and Marie whom we have learned to know in Lady Brassey's books. The well-known author is the daughter of the late Mr. John Allnut of Berkeley Square, London, who, as well as his father, was a patron of art, having made large collections of paintings. Reared in wealth and culture, it was but natural that the daughter, Annie, should find in the wealthy and cultured Sir Thomas Brassey a man worthy of her affections. In 1860, while both were quite young, they were married, and together they have traveled, written books, aided working men and women, and made for themselves a noble and lasting fame. Sir Thomas is the eldest son of the late Mr. Brassey, the Leviathan contractor, the employer of untold thousands of navvies, the genie of the spade and pick, and almost the pioneer of railway builders, not only in his own country, but from one end of the continent to the other. Of superior education, having been at Rugby and University College, Oxford, Sir Thomas was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn in 1864, and was elected to Parliament from Devonport the following year, and from Hastings 3 years later, in 1868, which position he has filled ever since. Exceedingly fond of the sea, he determined to be a practical sailor, and qualified himself as a master marine by passing the requisite Board of Trade examination, and receiving a certificate as a seaman and navigator. In 1869 he was made honorary lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve. Besides his parliamentary work, he has been an able and voluminous writer. His Foreign Work and English Wages I purchased in England, and have found it valuable in facts and helpful in spirit. The statement in the preface that he has had under consideration the expediency of retiring from Parliament with the view of devoting an undivided attention to the elucidation of industrial problems and the improvement of the relations between capital and labor, shows the heart of the man. In 1880 he was made Civil Lord of the Admiralty, and in 1881 was created by the Queen a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, for his important services in connection with the organization of the naval reserve forces of the country. In 1869, after Sir Thomas and Lady Brassey had been 9 years married, they determined to take a sea voyage in his yacht, and between this time and 1872 they made 2 cruises in the Mediterranean and the East. From her childhood the wife had kept a journal, and from fine powers of observation and much general knowledge was well fitted to see whatever was to be seen, and describe it graphically. She wrote long, journal-like letters to her father, and on her return, The Flight of the Meteor was prepared for distribution among relatives and intimate friends. In the year last mentioned, 1872, they took a trip to Canada and the United States, sailing up several of the long rivers, and on her return, A Cruise in the Eothen was published for friends. 4 years later they decided to go round the world, and for this purpose the beautiful yacht Sunbeam was built. The children, the animal pets, 2 dogs, 3 birds, and a Persian kitty for the baby were all taken, and the happy family left England July 1st, 1876. With the crew, the whole number of persons on board was 43. Almost at the beginning of the voyage they encountered a severe storm. Captain Lecky would have been lost but for the presence of mind of Mabel Brassey, the oldest daughter, who has her mother's courage and calmness. When asked if she thought she was going overboard, she answered, "I did not think at all, mamma, but felt sure we were gone." Soon after this adventure, says Lady Brassey, we all went to bed, full of thanksgiving that it had ended as well as it did, but alas, not, so far as I was concerned, to rest in peace. In about 2 hours I was awakened by a tremendous weight of water suddenly descending upon me and flooding the bed. I immediately sprang out, only to find myself in another pool on the floor. It was pitch dark, and I could not think what had happened, so I rushed on deck, and found that the weather having moderated a little, some kind sailor, knowing my love of fresh air, had opened the skylight rather too soon, and one of the angry waves had popped on board, deluging the cabin. I got a light and proceeded to mop up as best I could, and then endeavored to find a dry place to sleep in. This, however, was no easy task, for my own bed was drenched, and every other berth occupied. The deck, too, was ankle deep in water, as I found when I tried to get across to the deck-house sofa. At last I lay down on the floor, wrapped in my ulster, and wedged between the foot-stanchion of our swing bed and the wardrobe athwartship, so that as the yacht rolled heavily my feet were often higher than my head. No wonder that a woman who could make the best of such circumstances could make a year's trip on the Sunbeam a delight to all on board. Their first visits were to the Madeira, Teneriffe, and Cape de Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. With simplicity, the charm of all writing, and naturalness, Lady Brassey describes the people, the bathing where the sharks were plentiful, and the masses of wild geranium, hydrangea, and fuchsia. They climbed to the top of the lava peak of Teneriffe, over 12,000 feet high. They rise at 5 o'clock to see the beautiful sunrises. They watch the slaves at coffee raising at Rio de Janeiro, in South America, and Lady Brassey is attracted toward the 19 tiny babies by the side of their mothers, the youngest a dear little woolly-headed thing, as black as jet, and only 3 weeks old. In Belgrano, she says, "We saw for the first time the holes of the bizcachas, or prairie dogs, outside which the little prairie owls keep guard. They appeared to be always one and generally two of these birds standing like sentinels at the entrance to each hole, with their wise-looking heads on one side, pictures of prudence and watchfulness. The bird and the beast are great friends, and are seldom to be found apart." And then Lady Brassey, who understands photography as well as how to write several languages, photographs this pretty scene of prairie dogs guarded by owls, and puts it in her book. On their way to the Straits of Magellan they see a ship on fire. They send out a boat to her, and bring in the suffering crew of 15 men, almost wild with joy to be rescued. Their cargo of coal had been on fire for 4 days. The men were exhausted. The fires beneath their feet were constantly growing hotter, and finally they gave up in despair and lay down to die. But the captain said, "There is one above who looks after us all," and again they took courage. They lashed the 2 apprentice boys in one of the little boats for fear they would be washed overboard, for one was the only son of his mother, and she a widow. "The captain," says Lady Brassey, "drowned his favorite dog, a splendid Newfoundland, just before leaving the ship, for although a capital watchdog and very faithful, he was rather large and fierce, and when it was known that the Sunbeam was a yacht with ladies and children on board, he feared to introduce him. Poor fellow! I wish I had known about it in time to save his life." They streamed past the lowly sandy coast of Patagonia and the rugged mountains of Tierra del Fuego, literally Land of Fire, so called from the custom the inhabitants have of lighting fires on prominent points as signals of assembly. The people are cannibals and naked. Their food is of the most meagre description, and consists mainly of shellfish, sea eggs, for which the women dive with much dexterity, and fish which they train their dogs to assist them in catching. These dogs are sent into the water at the entrance of a narrow creek or small bay, and they then bark and flounder about and drive the fish before them into shallow water, where they are caught. 3 of these fusions, a man, woman, and lad, come out to the yacht in a craft made of planks rudely tied together with the sinews of animals, and give otter skins for tobacco and galata biscuit, for which they call. When Lady Brassey gives the lad and his mother some strings of blue, red, and green glass beads, they laugh and jabber most enthusiastically. Their paddles are split branches of trees, with wider pieces tied on at one end, with the sinews of birds or beasts. At the various places where they land, all go armed, Lady Brassey herself being well skilled in their use. She never forgets to do a kindness. In Chile she hears that a poor engine driver, an Englishman, has met with a serious accident, and at once hastens to see him. He is delighted to hear about the trip of the Sunbeam, and forgets for a time his intense suffering in his joy at seeing her. In Santiago she describes a visit to the ruin of the Jesuit church, where, December 8, 1863, at the Feast of the Virgin, 2,000 persons, mostly women and children, were burned to death. A few were drawn up through a hole in the roof, and thus saved. Their visit to the South Sea Islands is full of interest. At Bow Island, Lady Brassey buys 2 tame pigs for 25 cents each, which are so docile that they follow her about the yacht with the dogs, to whom they took a decided fancy. She calls one Agag, because he walks so delicately on his toes. The native women break coconuts, and offer them the milk to drink. At Maitea the natives are puzzled to know why the island is visited. "No sell brandy?" they ask. "No." "No steely men?" "No." "No do what then?" The chief receives most courteously, cutting down a banana tree for them when they express a wish for bananas. He would receive no money for his presents to them. In Tahiti a feast is given in their honor, in a house seemingly made of banana trees. the floor covered with the finest mats, and the center strewn with broad green plantain leaves to form the tablecloth. Before each guest was placed a half cocoanut full of salt water, another full of chopped cocoanut, a third full of fresh water, and another full of milk, 2 pieces of bamboo, a basket of poi, half a breadfruit, and a platter of green leaves, the latter being changed with each course. We took our seats on the ground round the green table. The first operation was to mix the salt water and the chopped cocoanut together, so as to make an appetizing sauce, into which we were supposed to dip each morsel we ate. We were tolerably successful in the use of our fingers as substitutes for knives and forks. At the Sandwich Islands in Hilo, they visit the volcano of Kilauea. They descend the precipice, 300 feet, which forms the wall of the old crater. They ascend the present crater, and stand on the edge of a precipice, overhanging a lake of molten fire, 100 feet below us and nearly a mile across. Dashing against the cliffs of the opposite side, with a noise like the roar of a stormy ocean, waves of blood-red, fiery liquid lava hurled their billows upon an iron-bound headland, and then rushed up the face of the cliffs to toss their gory spray high in the air. They passed the island of Molokai, where the poor lepers end their days away from home and kindred. At Honolulu they are entertained by the prince, and then sail for Japan, China, Ceylon, through Suez, stopping in Egypt, and then home. On their arrival, Lady Brassey says, "How can I describe the warm greetings that met us everywhere, or the crowd that surrounded us? How, along the whole 10 miles from Hastings to Battle, people were standing by the roadside and at the cottage doors to welcome us. How the Battle bell ringers never stopped ringing except during service time, or how the warmest of welcomes ended our delightful year of travel, and made us feel we were home at last, with thankful hearts for the providential care which had watched oversee us whithersoever we roamed." The trip had been one of continued ovation. Crowds had gathered in every place to see the Sunbeam, and often trim her with flowers from stem to stern. Presents of parrots and kittens and pigs abounded, and Lady Brassey had cared tenderly for them all. Christmas was observed on shipboard with gifts for everybody. Thoughtfulness and kindness had made the trip a delight to the crew as well as the passengers. The letters sent home from the Sunbeam were so thoroughly enjoyed by her father and friends that they prevailed upon her to publish a book, which she did in 1878. It was found to be as full of interest to the world as it had been to the intimate friends, and it passed rapidly through 4 editions. An abridged edition appeared in the following year. Then the call for it was so great that an edition was prepared for reading in schools in 1880, and finally in 1881 a 12-cent edition, that the poor as well as the rich might have an opportunity of reading this fascinating book, Around the World in the Yacht Sunbeam. And now Lady Brassey found herself not only the accomplished and benevolent wife of a member of Parliament, but a famous author as well. This year, July, 1881, the King of the Sandwich Islands, who had been greatly pleased with her description of his kingdom, was entertained at Normanhurst Castle, and invested Lady Brassey with the order of Kapiolani. The next trip made was to the Far East, and a book followed in 1880, entitled Sunshine and Storm in the East, or Cruises to Cyprus and Constantinople, dedicated to the brave, true-hearted sailors of England of all ranks and services. The book is intensely interesting. Now she describes the Sultan going to the mosque, which he does every Friday at 12 o'clock. He appeared in a sort of undress uniform, with a flowing cloak over it, and with 2 or 3 large diamond stars on his breast. He was mounted on a superb white Arab charger, 33 years old, whose saddle-cloths and trappings blazed with gold and diamonds. The following of officers on foot was enormous, and then came 200 of the fat blue and gold pashas, with their white horses and brilliant trappings, the rear being brought up by some troops and a few carriages. Nobody dares address the Sultan, even if he speaks to them, except in monosyllables, with their foreheads almost touching the floor, the only exception being the Grand Vizier, who dares not look up, but stands almost bent double. He is entirely governed by his mother, who, having been a slave of the very lowest description, to whom his father, Mahmoud II., took a fancy, as she was carrying wood to the bath, is naturally bigoted and ignorant. The Sultan is not allowed to marry, but the slaves who become mothers of his children are called sultanas, and not allowed to do any more work. They have a separate suite of apartments, a retinue of servants, besides carriages and horses, and each hopes some day to the mother of the future Sultan, and therefore the most prominent woman in Turkey. The sultanas may not sit at table with their own children, on account of their having been slaves, while the children are princes and princesses in right of their father. Lady Brassey tells the amusing story of a visit of Eugenie to the Sultan's mother, when the Empress of the French saluted her on the cheek. The Turkish woman was furious, and said she had never been so insulted in her life. She retired to bed at once, was bled, and had several Turkish baths to purify her from the pollution. Fancy the Empress's feelings when, after having so far condescended as to kiss the old woman, born one of the lowest of slaves, she had her embrace received in such a manner. The habits and customs of the people are described by Lady Brassey with all the interest of a novel. On their return home, again the battle bells rang out a merry peal of gladness. Again everybody rushed out to welcome us. At home once again the servants and the animals seemed equally glad to see us back. The former looked the picture of happiness, while the dogs jumped and barked. The horses and ponies neighed and whinnied, the monkeys chattered, the cockatoos and parrots screamed, the birds chirped, the bullfinches piped their little paean of welcome. Our old Sussex cowman says that even the cows eat their food kind of kinder-like when the family are at home. The deer and the ostriches, too, the swans and the call ducks all came running to meet us as we drove round the place to see them. Kindness to both man and beast bears its legitimate fruit. 2 years later she prepared the letterpress to Tahiti, a series of photographs taken by Colonel Stuart Wortley. He also was a gentleman of much culture and noble work, in whose home we saw beautiful things gathered from many lands. The last long trip of Sir Thomas and Lady Brassey was made in the fall of 1883, and resulted in a charming book, In the Trades, the Tropics, and the Roaring Forties, with about 300 illustrations. The route lay through Madeira, Trinidad, Venezuela, the Bahamas, and home by way of the Azores. The resources of the various islands, their history, and their natural formation are ably told, showing much study as well as intelligent observation. The maps and charts are also valuable. At Trinidad they visit the fine botanic gardens and see bamboos, mangoes, peach palms, and cocoa plants, from whose seeds chocolate is made. The quantity exported annually is 13,000,000 pounds. They also visit green coffee plantations. The leaves of the coffee shrub, says Lady Brassey, are of a rich, dark, glossy green, the flowers, which grow in dense white clusters when in full bloom, giving the bushes the appearance of being covered with snow. The berries vary in color from pale green to reddish orange or dark red, according to their ripeness, and bear a strong resemblance to cherries. Each contains 2 seeds, which, when properly dried, become what is known to us as raw coffee. At Caracas they view with interest the place which, on March 26, 1812, was nearly destroyed by an earthquake, 12,000 persons perishing, thousands of whom were buried alive by the opening of the ground. They study the formation of coral reefs, and witness the gathering of sponges in the Bahamas. These are brought to the surface by hooked poles, or sometimes by diving. When first drawn from the water they are covered with a soft gelatinous substance, as black as tar and full of organic life, the sponge, as we know, being only the skeleton of the organism. While all this traveling was being enjoyed, and made most useful as well to hundreds of thousands of readers, Lady Brassey was not forgetting her works of philanthropy. For years she had been a leading spirit in the St. John's Ambulance Association. Last October she gave a valuable address to the members of the Workingmen's Club and Institute Union, composed of several hundred societies of workingmen. Her desire was that each society take up the work of teaching its members how to care for the body in case of accidents. The association, now numbering over 100,000 persons, is an offshoot of the ancient order of St. John of Jerusalem, founded 800 years ago, to maintain a hospital for Christian pilgrims. She says, The method of arresting bleeding from an artery is so easy that a child may learn it, yet thousands of lives have been lost through ignorance, the life blood ebbing away in the presence of sorrowing spectators, perfectly helpless, because none among them had been taught one of the first rudiments of instruction of an ambulance pupil, the application of an extemporized tourniquet. Again, how frequent is the loss of life by drowning, yet how few persons comparatively understand the way to treat properly the apparently drowned. Lectures are given by this association on first aid to the injured, also on the general management of the sick room. Lady Brassey, with the assistance of medical men, has held classes in all the outlying villages about her home, and has arranged that simple but useful medical appliances, like plasters, bandages, and the like, be kept at some convenient centers. At Trinidad and Bahamas and Bermudas, where they stayed there in their travels, she caused to be held large meetings among the most influential residents; also at Madeira and in the Azores. A class was organized on board the Sunbeam, and lectures were delivered by a physician. In the Shetland Islands she has also organized these societies, and thus many lives have been saved. When the soldiers went to the Soudan, she arranged for these helpful lectures to them on their voyage east, and among much other reading matter which she obtained for them, sent them books and papers on this essential medical knowledge. She carries on correspondence with India, Australia, and New Zealand, where ambulance associations have been formed. For her valued services she was elected in 1881 a Dame Chevalier of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Her work among the poor in the East End of London is admirable. Too much of this cannot be done by those who are blessed with wealth and culture. She is also interested in all that helps to educate the people, as is shown by her Museum of Natural History and Ethnological Specimens, open for inspection in the School of Fine Art at Hastings. How valuable is such a life compared with one that uses its time and money for personal gratification alone. In August 1885, Sir Thomas and Lady Brassey took Mr. and Mrs. Gladstone and a few other friends in the Sunbeam up the coast of Norway. When they landed at Stavanger, a quaint, clean little town, she says in the October Contemporary Review, "The reception which we met in this comparatively out-of-the-way place, where our visit had been totally unexpected, was very striking. From early morning little groups of townspeople had been hovering about the quays, trying to get a distant glimpse of the world-renowned statesman who was among our passengers. When they walked through the town, every window and doorway was filled with onlookers. Several flags had been hoisted in honor of the occasion, and the church bells were set ringing. It was interesting and touching to see the ex-minister walking up the narrow street, his hat almost constantly raised in response to the salutations of the townspeople. They sail up the fjords, they ride in stokjors over the journey, they climb mountains, they visit old churches, and they dine with the Prince of Wales on board the royal yacht Osborne. Before landing, Mr. Gladstone addresses the crew, thanking them that the voyage has been made pleasant and safe by their high sense of duty, constant watchfulness, and arduous exertion, while he admires the rare knowledge of practical seamanship of Sir Thomas Brassey, and thanks both him and his wife for their genial and generous hospitality. He does not forget the sailors, for whom he wishes health and happiness, and prays that God may speed you in all you undertake. Lady Brassey is living a useful and noble as well as intellectual life. In London, Sir Thomas and herself recently gave a reception to over 1,000 workingmen in the South Kensington Museum. Devoted to her family, she does not forget the best interests of her country, nor the welfare of those less fortunate than herself. Successful in authorship, she is equally successful in good works, loved at home and honored abroad. Lady Brassey's last voyage was made in the yacht she loved, the Sunbeam. 3 or 4 years before, her health had received a serious shock through an attack of typhoid fever, and it was hoped that travel would restore her. A trip was made in 1887 to Ceylon, Rangoon, North Borneo, and Australia, in company with Lord Brassey, a son and 3 daughters. While in mid-ocean, on their way to Mauritius, Lady Brassey died of malarial fever, and was buried at sea, September 14, 1887. End of section 17. Recording by jedopi. www.myaudiolibrary.blogspot.com
Section 18 of Lives of Girls Who Became Famous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of Girls Who Became Famous by Sarah K. Bolton. Section 18. Baroness Burdett-Coutts. We hear, with comparative frequency, of great gifts made by men. George Peabody and Johns Hopkins, Ezra Cornell and Matthew Vassar, Commodore Vanderbilt and Leland Stanford. But gifts of millions have been rare from women. Perhaps this is because they have not, as often as men, had the control of immense wealth. It is estimated that Baroness Burdett-Coutts has already given away from $15 to $20 million, and is constantly dispensing her fortune. She is feeling, in her lifetime, the real joy of giving. How many benevolent persons lose all this joy by waiting till death before they bestow their gifts? This remarkable woman comes from a remarkable family. Her father, Sir Francis Burdett, was one of England's most prominent members of Parliament. So earnest and eloquent was he that Canning placed him, "very nearly, if not quite, at the head of the orators of the day." His colleague from Westminster, Hobhouse, said, "Sir Francis Burdett was endowed with qualities rarely united. A manly understanding and a tender heart gave a charm to his society such as I have never derived in any other instance from a man whose principal pursuit was politics. He was the delight both of young and old." He was of fine presence, with great command of language, natural, sincere, and impressive. After being educated at Oxford, he spent some time in Paris during the early part of the French Revolution, and came home with enlarged ideas of liberty. With as much courage as eloquence, he advocated liberty of the press in England, and many parliamentary reforms. Whenever there were misdeeds to be exposed, he exposed them. The abuses of Cold Bath Fields and other prisons were corrected through his searching public inquiries. When one of his friends was shut up in Newgate for impugning the conduct of the House of Commons, Sir Francis took his part, and for this it was ordered that he too be arrested. Believing in free speech as he did, he denied the right of the House of Commons to arrest him, and for nearly 3 days barricaded his house, till the police forcibly entered and carried him to the Tower. A riot resulted, the people assaulting the police and the soldiers, for the statesman was very popular. Several persons were killed in the tumult. 9 years later, in 1819, because he condemned the proceedings of the Lancashire magistrates in a massacre case, he was again arrested for libel. His sentence was 3 months' imprisonment, and a fine of $5,000. The banknote with which the money was paid is still preserved in the Bank of England, "with an inscription in Burnet's own writing that to save his life, which further imprisonment threatened to destroy, he submitted to be robbed." For 30 years he represented Westminster, fearless in what he considered right, strenuous for the abolition of slavery and in all other reforms. Napoleon said at St. Helena, if he had invaded England as he had intended, he would have made it a republic, with Sir Francis Burdett, the popular idol, at its head. Wealthy himself, Sir Francis married Sophia, the youngest daughter of the wealthy London banker, Thomas Coutts. 1 son and 5 daughters were born to them, the youngest, Angela Georgina, April 21, 1814, now the Baroness Burdett-Coutts. Mr. Coutts was an eccentric and independent man, who married for his first wife an excellent girl of very humble position. Their children, from the great wealth of the father, married into the highest social rank, one being Marchioness of Bute, one Countess of Guilford, and the third Lady Burdett. When Thomas Coutts was 84, he married for the second time a well-known actress, Harriet Mellon, who for 7 years till his death took excellent care of him. He left her his whole fortune, amounting to several millions, feeling perhaps that he had provided sufficiently for his daughters at their marriage, by giving them $500,000 each. But Harriet Mellon, with a fine sense of honor, felt that the fortune belonged to his children. Though she married 5 years later the Duke of St. Albans, 24 years old, about half her own age, at her death in 10 years she left the whole property, some 15 millions, to Mr. Coutts' granddaughter, Angela Burdett. Only one condition was imposed, that the young lady should add the name of Coutts to her own. Miss Angela Burdett-Coutts became, therefore, at 23, the sole proprietor of the great Coutts banking house, which position she held for 30 years, and the owner of an immense fortune. Very many young men manifested a desire to help care for her property, and to share it with her, but she seems from the first to have had but one definite life purpose, to spend her money for the good of the human race. She had her father's strength of character, was well educated, and was a friend of royalty itself. Alas, how many young women, with $15,000,000 in hand, and the sum constantly increasing, would have preferred a life of display and self-aggrandizement rather than visiting the poor and the sorrowing. Baroness Burdett-Coutts is now over 70, and for 50 years her name has been one of the brightest and noblest in England, or indeed in the world. Crabb Robinson said, she is "the most generous and delicately generous person I ever knew." Her charities have extended in every direction. Among her first good works was the building of 2 large churches, one at Carlisle and another, St. Stephen's, at Westminster, the latter having also 3 schools and a parsonage. But Great Britain did not require all her gifts. Gospel work was needed in Australia, Africa, and British America. She therefore endowed 3 colonial bishoprics at Adelaide, Cape Town, and in British Columbia with $250,000. In South Australia she also provided an institution for the improvement of the aborigines, who were ignorant, and for whom the world seemed to care little. She has generously aided her own sex. Feeling that sewing and other household work should be taught in the national schools, as from her labors among the poor she had seen how often food was badly cooked, and mothers were ignorant of sewing, she gave liberally to the government for this purpose. Her heart also went out to children in the remote districts, who were missing all school privileges, and for these she arranged a plan of traveling teachers, which was heartily approved by the English authorities. Even now in these later years the Baroness may often be seen at the night schools of London, offering prizes, or encouraging the young men and women in their desire to gain knowledge after the hard day's work is done. She has opened reformatory homes for girls, and great good has resulted. Like Peabody, she has transformed some of the most degraded portions of London by her improved tenement houses for the poor. One place, called Nova Scotia Gardens (the term gardens was a misnomer), she purchased, tore down the old rookeries where people slept and ate in filth and rags, and built tasteful homes for 200 families, charging for them low and weekly rentals. Close by she built Columbia Market, costing over $1,000,000, intended for the convenience of small dealers and people in that locality, where clean, healthful food could be purchased. She opened a museum and reading room for the neighborhood, and brought order and taste out of squalor and distress. This building she presented to the city of London, and in acknowledgment of the munificent gift, the Common Council presented her, July 1872, in a public ceremony, the freedom of the city, an uncommon honor to a woman. It was accompanied by a complimentary address, enclosed in a beautiful gold casket with several compartments. One bore the arms of the Baroness, while the other 7 represented tableaux emblematic of her noble life: feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting the captive, lodging the homeless, visiting the sick, and burying the dead. The 4 cardinal virtues, prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice, supported the box at the 4 corners, while the lid was surmounted by the arms of the city. The Baroness made an able response to the address of the council, instead of asking some gentleman to reply for her. Women who can do valuable benevolent work should be able to read their own reports, or say what they desire to say in public speech, without feeling that they have in the slightest degree departed from the dignity and delicacy of their womanhood. 2 years later, 1874, Edinburgh, for her many charities, also presented the Baroness the freedom of the city. Queen Victoria, 3 years before this, in June 1871, had made her a peer of the realm. In Spitalfields, London, where the poverty was very great, she started a sewing school for adult women, and provided not only work for them, but food as well, so that they might earn for themselves rather than receive charity. To furnish this work she took contracts from the government. From this school she sent out nurses among the sick, giving them medical supplies and clothes for the deserving. When servants needed outfits, the Baroness provided them, aiding in all ways those who were willing to work. All this required much executive ability. So interested is she in the welfare of poor children, that she has converted some of the very old burying grounds of the city, where the bodies have long since gone back to dust, into playgrounds, with walks and seats and beds of flowers. Here the children can romp from morning till night, instead of living in the stifled air of the tenement houses. In old St. Pancras churchyard, now used as a playground, she has erected a sundial as a memorial to its illustrious head. Not alone does Lady Burdett-Coutts build churches and help women and girls. She has fitted hundreds of boys for the Royal Navy, educated them on her training ships. She usually tries them in a shoe-black brigade, and if they show a desire to be honest and trustworthy, she provides homes, either in the Navy or in some good trade. When men are out of work, she encourages them in various ways. When the East End weavers had become reduced to poverty by the decay of trade, she furnished funds for them to emigrate to Queensland with their families. A large number went together and formed a prosperous and happy colony, gratefully sending back thanks to their benefactor. They would have starved, or, what is more probable, have gone into crime in London. Now they were contented and satisfied in their new home. When the inhabitants of Girvan, Scotland, were in distress, she advanced a large sum to take all the needy families to Australia. Here in America we talk every now and then of forming societies to help the poor to leave the cities and go west, and too often the matter ends in talk. While here is a woman who forms a society in and of herself, and sends the suffering to any part of the world, expecting no money return on the capital used. To see happy and contented homes grow from our expenditures is such an investment of capital as helps to bring on the millennium. When the people near Skibbereen, Ireland, were in want, she sent food and clothing and fishing tackle to enable them to carry on their daily employment of fishing. She supplied the necessary funds for Sir Henry James's topographical survey of Jerusalem in the endeavour to discover the remains of King Solomon's temple, and offered to restore the ancient aqueduct to supply the city with water. Deeply interested in art, she has aided many struggling artists. Her homes also contain many valuable pictures. The heart of the Baroness seems open to distress from every clime. In 1877, when word reached England of the suffering through war of the Bulgarian and Turkish peasantry, she instituted the Compassion Fund, by which $150,000 in money and stores were sent, and thousands of lives saved from starvation and death. For this generosity the Sultan conferred upon her the Order of Medjidie, the first woman, it is said, who has received this distinction. In all this benevolence she has not overlooked the animal creation. She has erected 4 handsome drinking fountains, one in Victoria Park, one at the entrance to the Zoological Gardens in Regent's Park, one near Columbia Market, and one in the city of Manchester. At the opening of the latter, the citizens gave Lady Burdett-Coutts a most enthusiastic reception. To the unique and interesting Home for Lost Dogs in London she has contributed very largely. If the poor animals could speak, how would they thank her for a warm bed to lie on, and proper food to eat? Her private gifts to the poor have been numberless. Her city house, 1 Stratton Street, Piccadilly, and her country home at Holly Lodge, Highgate, are both well known. When, in 1868, the great reform procession passed her house, and she was at the window, though half out of sight, says a person who was present, "In one instant a shout was raised. For upwards of 2 hours and a half the air rang with the reiterated huzzas, huzzas unanimous and heartfelt, as if representing a national sentiment." At Holly Lodge, which one passes in visiting the grave of George Eliot at Highgate Cemetery, the Baroness makes thousands of persons happy year by year. Now she invites 2,000 Belgian volunteers to meet the Prince and Princess of Wales, with some 500 royal and distinguished guests. Now she throws open her beautiful gardens to hundreds of school children, and lets them play at will under the oak and chestnut trees. And now she entertains at tea all her tenants, numbering about 1,000. So genial and considerate is she that all love her, both rich and poor. She has fine manners and an open, pleasant face. For some years a young friend, about half her own age, Mr. William Ashmead Bartlett, had assisted her in dispensing her charities, and in other financial matters. At one time he went to Turkey at her request, using wisely the funds committed to his trust. Baroness Coutts had refused many offers of marriage, but she finally desired to bestow her hand upon this young but congenial man. On February 12, 1881, they were wedded in Christchurch, Piccadilly. Her husband took the name of Mr. Burdett-Coutts Bartlett, and has since become a capable member of Parliament. The marriage proved a happy one. The final years of the Baroness's long, useful life were rather secluded, being spent at her London residence, or at her delightful country place near Highgate, where she formerly entertained largely. On Christmas Eve, in 1906, she became ill of bronchitis, and though her wonderful vitality led her to revive somewhat, she finally succumbed on December 30, at the age of 92. She was greatly beloved from the highest to the humblest citizens. Queen Alexandra sent repeated inquiries and messages. King Edward once said that he regarded the Baroness, after his mother, as the most remarkable woman in England. Her life was a link with the past, as it began during the reign of Emperor Napoleon I, and witnessed the reigns of 5 British sovereigns. Throughout it was spent in doing good. End of Section 18. Section 19 of Lives of Girls Who Became Famous. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Lives of Girls Who Became Famous by Sarah K. Bolton. Section 19. Jean Ingelow. The same friend who had given me Mrs. Browning's 5 volumes in blue and gold came one day with a dainty volume just published by Roberts Brothers of Boston. They had found a new poet, and one possessing a beautiful name. Possibly it was a nom de plume, for who had heard any real name so musical as that of Jean Ingelow? I took the volume down by the quiet stream that flows below Amherst College, and, day after day, under a grand old tree, read some of the most musical words wedded to as pure thought as our country has produced. The world was just now beginning to know the high tide on the coast of Lincolnshire. Eyes were dimming as they read, I looked without, and lo, my son Came riding down with might and main. He raised a shout as he drew on, Till all the welkin rang again, Elizabeth! Elizabeth! A sweeter woman ne'er drew breath Than my son's wife, Elizabeth. The old sea wall, he cried, is down. The rising tide comes on apace, And boats adrift in yonder town Go sailing up the market place. He shook as one who looks on death. God save you, mother, straight he saith, Where is my wife, Elizabeth? And then the waters laid her body at his very door, and the sweet voice that called Cusha, 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 was stilled forever. The songs of 7 soon became as household words, because they were a reflection of real life. Nobody ever pictured a child more exquisitely than the little 7-year-old, who, rich with the little knowledge that seems much to a child, looks down from superior heights upon "the lambs that play always, they know no better, they are only 1 times 1." So happy is she that she makes boon companions of the flowers. "O brave marshberry buds, rich and yellow, give me your honey to hold. O columbine, open your folded wrapper, where 2 twin turtle doves dwell. O cuckoo pint, toll me the purple clapper that hangs in your clear green bell." At 7 times 2, who of us has not waited for the great heavy curtains of the future to be drawn aside? "I wish and I wish that the spring would go faster, nor long summer bide so late, and I could grow on, like the foxglove and aster, for some things are ill to wait." At 21 the girl's heart flutters with expectancy. "I leaned out of window, I smelt the white clover, dark, dark was the garden, I saw not the gate. Now, if there be footsteps, he comes, my one lover. Hush, nightingale, hush, O sweet nightingale, wait, till I listen and hear if a step draweth near, for my love he is late." At 28 a happy mother lives in a simple home, made beautiful by her children. "Heigh ho! Daisies and buttercups, mother shall thread them a daisy chain." At 35 a widow, at 42 giving up her children to brighten other homes, at 49 longing for home. "I had a nestful once of my own, ah, happy, happy I! Right dearly I loved them, but when they were grown, they spread out their wings to fly. Oh, one after another they flew away, far up to the heavenly blue, to the better country, the upper day, and I wish I was going too." The songs of 7 will be read and treasured as long as there are women in the world to be loved and men in the world to love them. My especial favorite in the volume was the poem "Divided." Never have I seen more exquisite kinship with nature, nor more delicate and tender feeling. Where is there so beautiful a picture as this? An empty sky, a world of heather, purple of foxglove, yellow of broom, we 2 among them, waiting together, shaking out honey, treading perfume. Crowds of bees are giddy with clover, crowds of grasshoppers skip at our feet, crowds of larks at their matins hang over, thanking the Lord for a life so sweet. We 2 walk till the purple dieth, and short dry grass under foot is brown, but one little streak at a distance lieth, green like a ribbon to prank the down. Over the grass we stepped into it, and God he knoweth how blithe we were. Never a voice to bid us eschew it, hey the golden ribbon that showed so fair. A shady freshness, chafers whirring, a little piping of leaf-hid birds, a flutter of wings, a fitful stirring, a cloud to the eastward, snowy as curds. Bare glassy slopes, where kids are tethered, round valleys like nests all ferny lined, round hills with fluttering tree-tops feathered, swell high in their freckled robes behind. Glitters the dew and shines the river, up comes the lily and dries her bell, but 2 are walking apart for ever, and wave their hands for a mute farewell. And yet I know past all doubting truly, and knowledge greater than grief can dim, I know, as he loved, he will love me duly, yea better, e'en better than I love him. And as I walk by the vast calm river, the awful river so dread to see, I say, thy breadth and thy depth for ever are bridged by his thoughts that cross to me. In what choice but simple language are we thus told that 2 loving hearts cannot be divided? Years went by, and I was at last to see the author of the poems I had loved in girlhood. I had wondered how she looked, what was her manner, and what were her surroundings. In Kensington, a suburb of London, in a 2-story-and-a-half stone house, cream-colored, lives Jean Ingelow. Tasteful grounds are in front of the home, and in the rear a large lawn bordered with many flowers, and conservatories. a real English garden, soft as velvet and fragrant as new-mown hay. The house is fit for a poet, roomy, cheerful, and filled with flowers. One end of the large double parlors seemed a bank of azaleas and honeysuckles, while great bunches of yellow primrose and blue forget-me-not were on the tables and in the bay windows. But most interesting of all was the poet herself, in middle life, with fine, womanly face, friendly manner, and cultivated mind. For an hour we talked of many things in both countries. Miss Ingelow showed great familiarity with American literature and with our national questions. While everything about her indicated deep love for poetry and a keen sense of the beautiful, her conversation, fluent and admirable, showed her to be eminently practical and sensible, without a touch of sentimentality. Her first work in life seems to be the making of her two brothers happy in the home. She usually spends her forenoons in writing. She does her literary work thoroughly, keeping her productions a long time before they are put into print. As she is never in robust health, she gives little time to society, and passes her winters in the south of France or Italy. A letter dated February 25, from the Alps Maritime, at Cannes, says, "This lovely spot is full of flowers, birds, and butterflies." Who that recalls her Songs on the Voices of Birds, the Blackbird and the Nightingale, will not appreciate her happiness with such surroundings? With great fondness for, and pride in, her own country, she has the most kindly feelings toward America and her people. She says in the preface of her novel, Fated to be Free, concerning this work and Off the Skelligs, "I am told that they are peculiar, and I feel they must be so, for most stories of human life are, or at least aim at being, works of art, selections of interesting portions of life and fitting incidents put together and presented as a picture is, and I have not aimed at producing a work of art at all, but a piece of nature." And then she goes on to explain her position to "her American friends," for she says, "I am sure you more than deserve of me some efforts to please you. I seldom have an opportunity of saying how truly I think so." Jean Ingelow's life has been a quiet but busy and earnest one. She was born in the quaint old city of Boston, England, in 1830. Her father was a well-to-do banker; her mother a cultivated woman of Scotch descent from Aberdeenshire. Jean grew to womanhood in the midst of 11 brothers and sisters, without the fate of struggle and poverty so common among the great. She writes to a friend concerning her childhood, "As a child I was very happy at times, and generally wondering at something. I was uncommonly like other children. I remember seeing a star, and that my mother told me of God who lived up there and made the star. This was on a summer evening. It was my first hearing of God, and made a great impression on my mind. I remember better than anything that certain ecstatic sensations of joy used to get hold of me, and that I used to creep into corners to think out my thoughts by myself. I was, however, extremely timid, and easily overawed by fear. We had a lofty nursery with a bow window that overlooked the river. My brother and I were constantly wondering at this river. The coming up of the tides, and the ships, and the jolly gangs of towers ragging them on with a monotonous song, made a daily delight for us. The washing of the water, the sunshine upon it, and the reflections of the waves on our nursery ceiling supplied hours of talk to us, and days of pleasure. At this time, being 3 years old, I learned my letters. I used to think a good deal, especially about the origin of things. People said often that they had been in this world, that house, that nursery, before I came. I thought everything must have begun when I did. No doubt other children have such thoughts, but few remember them. Indeed, nothing is more remarkable among intelligent people than the recollections they retain of their early childhood. A few, as I do, remember it all. Many remember nothing whatever which occurred before they were 5 years old. I have suffered much from a feeling of shyness and reserve, and I have not been able to do things by trying to do them. What comes to me comes of its own accord, and almost in spite of me. and I have hardly any power when verses are once written to make them any better. There were no hardships in my youth, but care was bestowed on me and my brothers and sisters by a father and mother who were both cultivated people." To another friend she writes, "I suppose I may take for granted that mine was the poetic temperament, and since there are no thrilling incidents to relate, you may think you should like to have my views as to what that means. I cannot tell you in an hour, or even a day, for it means so much. I suppose it, of its absence or presence, to make far more difference between one person and another than any contrast of circumstances can do. The possessor does not have it for nothing. It isolates, particularly in childhood. It takes away some common blessings, but then it consoles for them all." With this poetic temperament, that saw beauty in flower and sky and bird, that felt keenly all the sorrow and all the happiness of the world about her, that wrote of life rather than art, because to live rightly was the whole problem of human existence, with this poetic temperament the girl grew to womanhood in the city bordering on the sea. Boston, at the mouth of the Witham, was once a famous seaport, the rival of London in commercial prosperity in the 13th century. It was the site of the famous monastery of St. Botolph, built by a pious monk in 657. The town which grew up around it was called Botolph's town, contracted finally to Boston. From this town Reverend John Cotton came to America and gave the name to the capital of Massachusetts, in which he settled. The present famous old church of St. Botolph was founded in 1309, having a bell tower 300 feet high, which supports a lantern visible at sea for 40 miles. The surrounding country is made up largely of marshes reclaimed from the sea, which are called fens, and slightly elevated tracts of land called moors. Here Jean Ingelow studied the green meadows and the ever-changing ocean. Her first book, A Rhyming Chronicle of Incidents and Feelings, was published in 1850, when she was 20, and a novel, Allerton and Drew, in 1851. 9 years later, her Tales of Orris. But her fame came at 33, when her first full book of poems was published in 1863. This was dedicated to a much-loved brother, George K. Ingelow. "Your loving sister offers you these poems, partly as an expression of her affection, partly for the pleasure of connecting her effort with your name." The press everywhere gave flattering notices. A new singer had come, not one whose life had been spent in the study of Greek roots simply, but one who had studied nature and humanity. She had a message to give the world, and she gave it well. It was a message of good cheer, of earnest purpose, of contentment and hope. "What though unmarked the happy workmen toil, and break unthanked of man the stubborn clod? It is enough, for sacred is the soil, dear are the hills of God. Far better in its place the lowliest bird should sing aright to him the lowliest song, than that a seraph strayed should take the word and sing his glory wrong. But, like a river, blessed where'er it flows, be still receiving while it still bestows. That life goes best with those who take it best. It is well for us to be as happy as we can. Work is its own best earthly meed, else we have none more than the sea-born throng who wrought those marvellous isles that bloom afar." The London press said, "Miss Ingelow's new volume exhibits abundant evidence that time, study, and devotion to her vocation have both elevated and welcomed the powers of the most gifted poetess we possess, now that Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Adelaide Proctor sing no more on earth. Lincolnshire has claims to be considered the Arcadia of England at present, having given birth to Mr. Tennyson and our present Lady Laureate." The press of America was not less cordial. "Except for Mrs. Browning, Jean Ingelow is first among the women whom the world calls poets," said the Independent. The songs touched the popular heart, and some, set to music, were sung at numberless firesides. Who has not heard the "Sailing Beyond Seas"? "Methought the stars were blinking bright, and the old brig's sails unfurled. I said, I will sail to my love this night at the other side of the world. I stepped aboard, we sailed so fast, the sun shot up from the bourne. But a dove that perched upon the mast did mourn and mourn and mourn. O fair dove, O fond dove, and dove with the white breast, let me alone, the dream is my own, and my heart is full of rest. My love, he stood at my right hand, his eyes were grave and sweet. Methought he said, in this fair land, oh, is it thus we meet? Ah, maid most dear, I am not here, I have no place, no part, no dwelling more by sea or shore, but only in thy heart. O fair dove, O fond dove, till night rose over the bourne, the dove on the mast as we sailed past did mourn and mourn and mourn. Edmund Clarence Stedman, one of the ablest and fairest among American critics, says, "As the voice of Mrs. Browning grew silent, the songs of Miss Ingelow began, and had instant and merited popularity. They sprang up suddenly and tunefully, as skylarks from the daisy-spangled, hawthorn-bordered meadows of old England, with a blitheness long unknown, and in their idyllic underflights moved with the tenderest currents of human life. Miss Ingelow may be termed an idyllic lyrist, her lyrical pieces having always much idyllic beauty. High Tide, Winstanley, Songs of Seven, and The Long White Seam are lyrical treasures, and the author especially may be said to evince that sincerity which is poetry's most enduring warrant." Winstanley is especially full of pathos and action. We watch this heroic man as he builds the lighthouse on the Eddystone rocks. Then he and the sea began their strife, and worked with power and might. Whatever the man reared up by day, the sea broke down by night. A Scottish schooner made the port the 13th day at Eden. "As I am a man," the captain cried, "a strange sight I have seen. And a strange sound heard, my masters all, at sea, in the fog and the rain, like shipwrights' hammers tapping low, then loud, then low again. And a stately house one instant showed through a rift on the vessel's lee. What manner of creatures may be those that build upon the sea?" After the lighthouse was built, Winstanley went out again to see his precious tower. A fearful storm came up, and the tower and its builder went down together. Several books have come from Miss Ingelow's pen since 1863. The following year, Studies for Stories was published, of which the Athenaeum said, "They are prose poems, carefully meditated, and exquisitely touched in by a teacher ready to sympathize with every joy and sorrow." The 5 stories are told in simple and clear language, and without slang, to which she heartily objects. For one so rich in imagination as Miss Ingelow, her prose is singularly free from obscurity and florid language. Stories Told to a Child was published in 1865, and A Story of Doom and Other Poems in 1868, the principal poem being drawn from the time of the Deluge. Mopsa and the Fairy, an exquisite story, followed a year later, with A Sister's By Hours, and since that time, Off the Skelligs in 1872, Fated to be Free in 1875, Sarah de Beranger in 1879, and Don John in 1881, and Poems of the Old Days and the New, recently issued. Of the latter, the poet Stoddard says, "Beyond all the women of the Victorian era, she is the most of an Elizabethan. She has tracked the ocean journeyings of Drake, Raleigh, and Frobisher, and others to whom the Spanish Main was a second home, the El Dorado of which Columbus and his followers dreamed in their stormy slumbers. The first of her poems in this volume, Rosamund, is a masterly battle idyl." Her books have had large sale both here and in Europe. It is stated that in this country 100,000 of her poems have been sold, and half that number of her prose works. Miss Ingelow has not been elated by her deserved success. She has told the world very little of herself in her books. She once wrote a friend, I am far from agreeing with you that it is rather too bad when we read people's works if they don't let us know anything about themselves. I consider that an author should, during life, be as much as possible impersonal. I never import myself into my writings, and am much better pleased that others should feel an interest in me and wish to know something of me than that they should complain of egotism." It is said that the last of her Songs with Preludes refers to a brother who lies buried in Australia. "I stand on the bridge where last we stood, when delicate leaves were young. The children called us from yonder wood, while a mated blackbird sung. But if all loved as the few can love, this world would seldom be well. And who need wish, if he dwells above, for a deep, a long death knell? There are 4 or 5, who, passing this place, while they live, will name me yet, and when I am gone will think on my face, and feel a kind of regret." With all her literary work, she does not forget to do good personally. At one time she instituted a copyright dinner, at her own expense, which she thus described to a friend: "I have set up a dinner table for the sick poor, or rather for such persons as are just out of the hospitals, and are hungry, and not yet strong enough to work. We have about 12 to dinner 3 times a week, and hope to continue the plan. It is such a comfort to see the good it does. I find it one of the great pleasures of writing that it gives me more command of money for such purposes than falls to the lot of most women." Again, she writes to an American friend, "I should be much obliged to you if you would give in my name $25 to some charity in Boston. I should prefer such a one as does not belong to any party in particular, such as a city infirmary or orphan school. I do not like to draw money from your country and give none in charity." Miss Ingelow is very fond of children, and herein is, perhaps, one secret of her success. In Off the Skelligs she says, "Some people appear to feel that they are much wiser, much nearer to the truth and to realities than they were when they were children. They think of childhood as immeasurably beneath and behind them. I have never been able to join in such a notion. It often seems to me that we lose quite as much as we gain by our lengthened sojourn here. I should not at all wonder if the thoughts of our childhood, when we look back on it after the rending of this veil of our humanity, should prove less unlike what we were intended to derive from the teaching of life, nature, and revelation than the thoughts of our more sophisticated days." Best of all, this true woman and true poet as well, like Emerson, sees and believes in the progress of the race. "Still humanity grows dearer, being learned the more," she says in that tender poem, A Mother Showing the Portrait of Her Child. Blessed optimism! That amid all the shortcomings of human nature sees the best, lifts souls upward, and helps to make the world sunny by its singing. Jean Ingelow died in her home in Kensington, London, July 19, 1897, at the age of 67, having been born in Boston, Lincolnshire, in 1830. Her long illness ended in simple exhaustion, and she welcomed death gladly. End of Section 19. End of Lives of Girls Who Became Famous, by Sarah K. Bolton.